When Vanessa and I got married, I was convinced I had struck gold. She was everything I ever wanted. Kind, funny, and unpretentious. We were a team, or so I thought. Back then, she was a woman who loved simple joys, like lounging on the couch in her sweatpants, watching reruns of old sitcoms. I loved that version of her. But somewhere along the line, the Vanessa I married began to fade away, replaced by someone I barely recognized. It started subtly. At first, it was harmless selfies, her capturing the perfect lighting while we were on a date. I didn't mind much. I even teased her about it. Better get my good side, I joke. But over time, it became more than just photos. Our private moments turned into content for her growing Instagram following. Dinners were delayed because she had to get the perfect picture of her plate. Walks on the beach were cut short by the need to shoot a reel. Our life wasn't ours anymore. It was her audience's. 6 years into our marriage, I felt like a prop in her show. Vanessa was no longer my grounded, joyful partner. She was obsessed with chasing the validation of strangers online. Every morning, she'd wake up and check her stats before even saying good morning. I'd watch her from across the room, my heart sinking a little more each day. It was during one of her content creation sessions that I first noticed Mark. He was a fitness trainer she had met at a networking event, and his name started popping up a lot. At first, I brushed it off. She was always meeting people in her line of work. But then I started noticing their interactions online. He was in the comments of nearly every post. Looking great, Vanessa. Killing it as always. Clapping hands. At first, I tried to convince myself it was innocent. But deep down, I knew something was off. The way she laughed at his messages, how she seemed to light up when she talked about their collaborations. I wanted to believe in her, in us, but doubts crept in. The turning point came one evening when Vanessa left her laptop open. I wasn't snooping, I swear, but a message popped up, and my eyes couldn't help but land on it. "Last night was amazing," Mark wrote. "Can't wait to do it again." My hands went cold. The words stared back at me like a slap across the face. I wanted to slam the laptop shut, but I couldn't look away. There was a whole thread of messages. Flirty, suggestive, unmistakable. My heart raced, my chest tightened, and for the first time in my marriage, I felt like I didn't know the woman I had vowed to spend my life with. That night, I didn't say a word. Vanessa was in the next room, probably scrolling through her phone, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. I lay awake, replaying every interaction, every late-night work meeting, every excuse she had made over the past few months. It all started adding up. But I wasn't the kind of guy to explode in anger. I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I decided to wait, to gather proof. If Vanessa was going to betray me, she wasn't going to gaslight me into thinking I was crazy. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Every time Vanessa smiled at me or kissed my cheek, I felt like screaming. I wanted to grab her by the shoulders and demand she tell me everything. But instead, I played it cool. I couldn't let her know what I'd found. Not yet. I started watching her more closely, noticing the little things I'd ignored before. Like how her phone was always glued to her hand, even late at night when we were supposed to be winding down together. Or how she'd suddenly start laughing at texts, then claim it was a funny meme from her influencer group chat. It was hard to sit there and pretend I believed her, but I knew I needed more evidence. If she was going to lie, I'd make sure there was no way out for her. One evening, she was in the shower, and her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Mark's name lit up the screen. "Can we talk? I miss you." The nerve of this guy, texting her right under my nose. My hands itched to pick up the phone, but I stopped myself. A confrontation now wouldn't get me anywhere. I needed to know the full story. Instead, I made use of my skills. Before we got married, I'd worked in IT for years, and let's just say I knew my way around a computer. That night, after Vanessa fell asleep, I took her laptop and started digging. It didn't take long to find the treasure trove of messages. They'd been seeing each other for months. There were texts, emails, even receipts for hotel rooms I didn't recognize. The betrayal was there in black and white. One message stood out to me. It wasn't from Mark, it was from Vanessa. She had written, "Adrian's so predictable. He'd never suspect a thing." That one hit me like a punch to the gut. She wasn't just cheating on me, she was mocking me, painting me as some clueless husband too stupid to see what was happening right under his nose. That was the moment something inside me shifted. I wasn't just heartbroken anymore. I was angry. But I didn't lose my cool. If anything, I became colder, more calculating. If she thought I was predictable, I'd use that to my advantage. The next few weeks, I started working on my plan. I created an anonymous Instagram account, one that could blend in easily with her sea of followers. I used it to leave subtle comments on her posts, things that only she and Mark would understand. The hotel lighting is perfect here. I love this restaurant. Great spot for a date. At first, she ignored them, but over time, I noticed her becoming more paranoid. She'd delete the comments within minutes, then glance around the room like she thought someone was watching her. Good. Let her feel a fraction of the anxiety I'd been living with. Meanwhile, I started putting together a timeline. Every suspicious text, every late-night disappearance, every unexplained charge on our credit card. I documented it all. I even found a way to access her private messages on Instagram, where she and Mark exchanged everything from flirty banter to full-blown declarations of love. It was sickening to read, but it fueled me. The worst part was seeing how she talked about me. "Adrian's so boring," she'd written in one message. "I don't know why I'm still with him." I clenched my fists as I read those words, my heart pounding in my chest. I had spent years building a life with this woman, supporting her dreams, and this was how she saw me? It was like she had turned into a completely different person, one I didn't recognize and certainly didn't love anymore. But instead of confronting her, I kept playing the role of the doting husband. I smiled when she showed me her latest Instagram posts, laughed at her stories about the influencer world, and acted like I was too busy at work to notice anything amiss. If she wanted to underestimate me, I'd let her. She had no idea what was coming. Keeping up appearances wasn't easy. Every time Vanessa touched my arm or smiled at me, it felt like a cruel joke. I started to hate the sight of her phone, the way she'd angle it just so to snap another selfie or scroll through Mark's shirtless posts. The worst part? I wasn't even sure she noticed how distant I'd become. She was so wrapped up in her world that she barely registered the growing cracks in ours. One night, as we sat across from each other at dinner, I decided to test the waters. "You've been really busy lately," I said, my tone casual. "Another campaign coming up?" She didn't look up from her plate. "Yeah, lots of stuff in the works. It's exciting but exhausting, you know?" "Must be. You're out a lot these days." She paused, her fork hovering mid-air. For a split second, I saw something flicker across her face. Guilt, maybe? Or fear? But just as quickly, she recovered. "Networking," she said, forcing a smile. "You know how it is." I nodded, pretending to accept her excuse, but inside, I was screaming. Networking. That's what she called it now? Sneaking around with Mark, lying to my face. It was all just networking. After dinner, she disappeared into the bedroom to edit some photos. I poured myself a drink and stared at the wall, letting the anger simmer. I couldn't keep living like this, pretending everything was fine while she was off building a second life without me. It was time to move things forward. The next morning, I called out sick from work and headed into town. First stop, our bank. Vanessa had access to our joint accounts, and over the years, I'd let her handle most of the spending. I never thought twice about it. Until now. The more I thought about her secret hotel stays and fancy dinners with Mark, the more I realized how much of our money she might have been blowing on her double life. I froze our joint accounts that day, transferring what I could into a private account under my name. I left just enough for her to think everything was normal, but the rest was mine. If she wanted to play games, I'd make sure she didn't do it on my dime. Then I went to see a lawyer. Sitting in that office, explaining my situation to a stranger, made everything feel more real. The lawyer was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who didn't flinch when I laid it all out. Vanessa's affair, her lies, even the proof I'd gathered. "You've got a solid case," she said, flipping through the folder I handed her. "But if you want to protect yourself financially, you'll need to act fast. Any joint assets could be at risk once she realizes you're serious about divorce." Divorce. The word felt heavy in my chest, like a door slamming shut. But what other choice did I have? The woman I loved was gone, replaced by someone who saw me as nothing more than an ATM and a backup plan. On the way home, I stopped at a hardware store and picked up new locks. It felt petty, but I didn't care. If Vanessa was going to keep betraying me, the least I could do was make her sweat a little. That evening, I came home to find her in the living room, scrolling through her phone as usual. She barely looked up when I walked in. "Hey," she said absently. "How was work?" "Busy," I lied, setting my bag down. "What about you?" "Same," she replied, her tone distracted. "Just working on a new campaign." I couldn't help but smile at the irony. She was so convinced I was the clueless husband, too naive to notice the truth. If only she knew how much I'd uncovered. That night, as she slept, I changed the passwords on all our shared accounts, email, streaming services, even the Wi-Fi. It was a small move, but it gave me a strange sense of control, like I was reclaiming pieces of my life bit by bit. The next day, Vanessa noticed. "Hey, did the Wi-Fi go down?" she called from the living room. I stuck my head out from the kitchen, feigning ignorance. "Not that I know of." "Try restarting it." A few minutes later, she appeared in the doorway, her phone in hand. "I can't log into Netflix either." "Did you change the password?" I shrugged. "Probably. I've been updating some stuff for security." She frowned, clearly annoyed, but didn't push it. "Okay, well, just let me know what it is when you get a chance." "Sure," I said, knowing full well I had no intention of giving it to her. As I watched her walk away, a part of me felt guilty. This wasn't who I was. I wasn't the kind of guy who played games or plotted revenge. But Vanessa had pushed me to this point. If she thought she could betray me and walk away unscathed, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. Over the next few days, I stuck to my routine: go to work, come home, and play the part of the clueless husband. But beneath the surface, I was working overtime. Vanessa's betrayal wasn't just a personal wound, it was an insult to everything we had built together. If she wanted to destroy our marriage, I'd make sure she didn't come out of it with her influencer-perfect life intact. Vanessa, of course, remained oblivious. Her days were spent glued to her phone or planning photo shoots, and her evenings were full of mysterious workouts that conveniently kept her out late. She thought she had me fooled, and I let her believe it. Every time she left the house, I took the opportunity to tighten my grip on the situation. I started with her social media accounts. It wasn't hard to gain access. She used the same passwords for everything. Within minutes, I was inside her Instagram, scrolling through her DMs and draft posts. The messages confirmed what I already knew. Mark wasn't just a fling, he was a full-blown obsession. She'd sent him selfies, complained about me, even hinted at running away together someday. The thought of her leaving everything behind, me, our home, our life, was almost laughable. Vanessa wasn't built for hardship. She needed her curated life, her followers, her carefully constructed image. And that's where I'd strike. Using an anonymous email, I created a fake collaboration opportunity and sent it to Vanessa. The proposal was enticing enough to catch her attention. A free stay at a luxury hotel in exchange for promotion. Predictably, she jumped at the chance. She even gushed about it at dinner that night, barely containing her excitement. "This could be huge for me," she said, her eyes sparkling. "It's exactly the kind of brand I've been hoping to work with." I nodded along, biting back the urge to call her out. Sounds like a great opportunity. The fake collaboration was just the beginning. Over the next week, I used her accounts to schedule posts that seemed harmless at first but carried subtle messages. A photo of her and Mark at the gym was captioned, "Thanks for pushing me to my limits," winking face. A picture of her holding a coffee cup read, "Morning fuel after a wild night out. Can't wait to do it again." The comments poured in quickly, ranging from confusion to outright accusations. "Doesn't your husband mind?" one person wrote. "Who's Mark?" asked another. Watching her followers turn on her was like watching cracks spread through a sheet of glass. Her polished facade was starting to shatter. Vanessa noticed the shift almost immediately. "Something weird is happening with my Instagram," she said one night, her voice tinged with panic. "People are commenting these weird things." "Weird how?" I asked, feigning concern. "I don't know. It's like someone's trying to sabotage me." "Maybe it's just trolls," I suggested. "You know how the internet can be." She nodded but didn't look convinced. Over the next few days, her anxiety grew. She'd spend hours on her phone, deleting comments and messaging her content creator friends for advice. She even asked me if I thought she should hire a social media manager to handle the situation. Probably a good idea, I said, hiding my smirk. Your image is everything in your line of work. As her online world began to crumble, I turned my attention to our finances. Vanessa wasn't the only one who could play dirty. Using the data I'd collected, I rerouted funds from our joint accounts into my personal savings. I made sure to cover my tracks, leaving just enough in the joint account to keep her from noticing, at least for now. Then came the Tesla. The car was technically under my name, and with a few phone calls, I arranged for it to be repossessed. Watching her scramble the next morning when she realized it was gone was almost too satisfying. "What happened to the car?" she demanded, storming into the kitchen where I was sipping coffee. "No idea," I said calmly. "Maybe you should call the dealership." She did, of course, only to find out that the payments had mysteriously stopped. I watched her pace the living room, phone pressed to her ear, her frustration growing by the second. She had no idea she was standing in the middle of a minefield, and every step she took was detonating another one. That evening, she confronted me. "Adrian, I feel like everything's falling apart," she said, her voice trembling. "My Instagram's a mess. The car's gone. I don't know what's happening." I put down my book and looked at her, my expression neutral. "Sounds like a lot to deal with. Maybe you should take a step back, focus on what's important." Her eyes narrowed slightly, suspicion flickering across her face. "What do you mean by that?" "Just that maybe it's time to reassess your priorities," I said, shrugging. "Figure out what really matters." She stared at me for a moment, searching my face for any hint of an ulterior motive. But I'd gotten good at hiding my cards. After a few seconds, she sighed and sat down, looking more defeated than I'd ever seen her. For the first time in months, I felt like I had the upper hand. Vanessa's unraveling was becoming more obvious by the day. Her once flawless confidence started to chip away. She spent hours glued to her laptop, desperately trying to regain control of her sinking online empire. I watched her from a distance, a quiet observer as her carefully curated world began to implode. "Adrian," she said one evening, her voice shaky, "I think someone's hacked my accounts." I set down my mug and looked up from the newspaper. "Hacked? What makes you think that?" "There are posts I didn't write. And messages I don't remember sending. It's like someone's pretending to be me." I raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "That's serious. Did you change your passwords?" "Of course I did," she snapped, then softened. "But it keeps happening. I don't know who would do this to me." "That's awful," I said, leaning back in my chair. "You've made a lot of connections, though. Maybe someone's jealous?" Her eyes widened, and she nodded slowly, as if the idea had just occurred to her. "You're right. It has to be someone in the industry. Maybe even one of my so-called friends." Bingo. Let her chase shadows while I worked in the light. The chaos wasn't just online anymore. Vanessa's sponsorship deals started to fall apart. Her biggest partnership, a major fitness brand, terminated her contract after her altered posts painted her as unprofessional and inappropriate. She was devastated. "They dropped me," she said, her voice cracking as she held up the termination email. "They said I'm no longer in alignment with the brand's values." I glanced at the screen and frowned sympathetically. "That doesn't make sense. You've worked with them for years." "It's because of those posts," she wailed, pacing the room. "This hacker, whoever they are, they're ruining my life." I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling. She was right, of course, but she'd never guess who the real hacker was. Vanessa's panic hit a new high when the fallout reached Mark. His wife, yes, the shirtless wonder was married, found out about their affair through one of the damning Instagram posts. She wasn't just angry, she was vengeful. She exposed everything, flooding social media with screenshots of their texts and tagging both Vanessa and Mark in every post. Vanessa's followers, who once adored her, turned on her in a heartbeat. Comments like "homewrecker" and "fake role model" flooded her page. Brands she hadn't even worked with yet started pulling out of potential collaborations. She was radioactive. Mark didn't take the backlash quietly, either. He made a public statement throwing Vanessa under the bus, claiming she had pursued him and that their relationship was a mistake he deeply regretted. His wife filed for divorce the next day, dragging Vanessa's name through the mud in the process. That night, Vanessa sat at the kitchen table, her face pale and drawn. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "I don't know what to do, Adrian," she whispered. "Everything's falling apart." I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Maybe it's time to take a break. Step away from social media for a while." "I can't just disappear," she said, shaking her head. "It's my career." "Is it worth your sanity?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. "You're miserable, Vanessa. Look at yourself." Her lip trembled, and for a moment, I thought she might actually listen. But then she straightened up, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "I'll fix this," she said, more to herself than to me. "I just need time." Time was the one thing she didn't have. The next day, I froze our shared credit cards. Vanessa found out when she tried to buy a designer handbag to treat herself, and her card was declined. Her panic quickly turned to fury. "Adrian," she shouted, storming into the living room where I was reading. "What the hell is going on with our accounts?" I looked up, keeping my expression neutral. "I froze them." "What? Why?" "Because we need to reassess our finances," I said calmly. "Things are tight right now, and I don't want us overspending." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "Tight? You're joking, right? We're fine. Are we?" I asked, setting down my book. "With all the cancelled deals and unexpected expenses, I think it's smart to be cautious." Her face turned red, and for a moment, I thought she might throw something. But instead, she stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The sound of her car engine roaring to life followed a few seconds later. I didn't chase after her. Let her stew. Later that night, she came home looking disheveled, her eyes rimmed with red. She threw her purse onto the couch and glared at me. "You've changed," she said, her voice cold. "You're not the man I married." I tilted my head, studying her. "And you're not the woman I married. Funny how that works." Her face crumpled, and for a split second, I felt a pang of guilt. But then I remembered the messages, the lies, the betrayal. Whatever bond we'd once shared was long gone, replaced by the ashes of her choices. "Maybe this marriage isn't working anymore," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Finally, the words I'd been waiting for. Vanessa's words, "Maybe this marriage isn't working anymore," hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had long since burned out. I didn't flinch, didn't argue. I just looked at her, letting the weight of her own declaration sink in. "Maybe it's not," I said quietly, keeping my voice steady. Her eyes flicked to mine, searching for something, anger, regret, a fight. But I wasn't going to give her any of that. If she wanted out, I'd let her walk straight into the trap she'd built for herself. She folded her arms and turned away, pacing the room. "We've grown apart, Adrian. You're distant, cold. I don't feel like you even see me anymore." I almost laughed at the irony. "You mean the way you've been seeing Mark?" Her body stiffened, and for a moment, there was complete silence. Then she turned, her face pale but defiant. "You're crazy," she said, her voice trembling. "There's nothing going on between me and Mark." "Don't lie to me, Vanessa," I said, standing up. "I've seen the messages. I know about the hotel rooms, the late nights, the texts. You've been cheating on me for months." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She wasn't used to being caught off guard. "That's not. I didn't." "Don't," I said, cutting her off. "Don't insult me by denying it." She sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she muttered. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. "But it did. And now you've destroyed everything we built together. For what? For some guy who doesn't even have the decency to stand by you when things go south." Her head snapped up, and for the first time, I saw real anger in her eyes. "Don't act like you're innocent, Adrian. You've been distant for years. You never supported my career. You always acted like my dreams didn't matter." "Your dreams," I repeated, shaking my head. "Your dreams have been tearing this family apart." You cared more about likes and followers than us. Don't pin this on me. She opened her mouth to argue, but the words seemed to die in her throat. Instead, she just sat there, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. Where do we go from here? She asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. That depends, I said. Are you willing to fight for this marriage? To own up to what you've done and rebuild what you've broken? She hesitated, and in that moment, I knew the answer. She wasn't ready to give up her fantasy life. Not for me, not for us. I don't know, she admitted, looking down at her hands. I need time to think. I nodded, my expression unreadable. Take all the time you need. I'll be filing for divorce in the meantime. Her head shot up, her eyes wide with panic. Adrian, wait. No, I said firmly. You don't get to make that call anymore. You've been making decisions for both of us for far too long. With that, I walked out, leaving her sitting alone in the wreckage of her choices. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. I moved quickly, filing for divorce and serving her the papers before she could spin any excuses. Vanessa was blindsided, but she didn't fight back, at least, not at first. I think a part of her thought she could charm me into changing my mind, the way she had with so many others. But I wasn't the same man she'd been manipulating for years. I changed the locks on the house and had her belongings packed up and delivered to a storage unit. When she tried to argue, I reminded her that the house was in my name, a detail she'd always overlooked in her rush to claim the spotlight. You can't just throw me out like this, she said, her voice trembling with indignation. You threw yourself out the moment you chose him over us, I replied coldly. Her online presence continued to crumble. Every time she posted, more accusations flooded her comments. Her follower count dropped daily, and brands that once clamored for her attention were now distancing themselves as quickly as possible. The final blow came when Mark, desperate to salvage his own reputation, leaked a statement claiming Vanessa had manipulated him into the affair. It was a blatant lie, but by then, no one was willing to hear her side of the story. She tried to confront me one last time, showing up at the house unannounced. I let her in, partly out of curiosity, partly because I wanted to see how far she'd fall. Adrian, please, she said, her voice cracking. I made a mistake. I know I did. But we can fix this. We can start over. I looked at her, taking in the woman I once loved and barely recognized now. You don't get it, do you? I said, shaking my head. There's nothing to fix. You destroyed it all. And for what? Validation? Attention? You chose strangers over the man who would have stood by you through anything. Tears streamed down her face, but I felt no sympathy. She had made her bed, and now she'd lie in it. Goodbye, Vanessa, I said, opening the door for her. Don't come back. The days that followed were quiet, almost surreal. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. I wasn't just a prop in someone else's story. I was writing my own. But this wasn't the end. The biggest revelation was still to come, and it would change everything I thought I knew about my life and marriage. Vanessa's departure left the house eerily quiet. I spent my days trying to find normalcy, organizing the life she had scattered into chaos. But just as I thought I was done uncovering her lies, a call from my lawyer turned everything upside down. I was reviewing your financial records, she began, her tone cautious. There's something odd. Large payments made over several years. They're consistent, but they don't match anything in your normal expenses. What kind of payments? I asked, already bracing for bad news. They're tuition fees, she replied. For a private school. I froze. Private school? Vanessa and I didn't have children, so who could this possibly be for? I thanked her and hung up, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. If these payments were real, they could only mean one thing. Vanessa had been hiding something massive. I spent the next day chasing answers. A forensic accountant confirmed the payments had been ongoing for 4 years. I requested details from the school, and after some persistence, they reluctantly shared a photo of the student in question. The boy was 6 years old. His name was Liam. When I saw his face, my stomach dropped. He had Vanessa's dark eyes, her unmistakable features. But the rest? The rest wasn't me. The truth was as clear as the photo in front of me. Vanessa had a child, and I wasn't his father. I confronted her the same night. She arrived at the house looking wary, as if she could sense this wasn't just another argument about her affair. "What's this about, Adrian?" she asked, her voice brittle. I didn't answer. I placed Liam's photo on the table and watched the color drain from her face. "You have something you want to tell me?" I asked. She stared at the photo, her hands trembling. "I can explain," she whispered. "Explain?" I snapped. "Explain how you've been hiding a child from me for 6 years? How you lied to my face every day of our marriage?" Tears welled in her eyes. "I didn't know how to tell you. I was scared. I thought you'd leave me." I laughed bitterly. "You should have been scared. You let me believe we had an honest marriage while you were funneling money to your secret child. Who's his father, Vanessa? Don't lie to me." Her gaze fell to the floor, and for a moment, I thought she wouldn't answer. Then, quietly, she said, "It's not Mark. It's someone I was seeing before we got married." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about the affair anymore. She had been lying to me since the beginning, since before we even said our vows. "You built our entire life on a lie," I said, my voice shaking. "Every moment, every promise. It was all fake." "No," she cried. "I loved you, Adrian. I still do. I didn't know how to handle it. Liam wasn't part of the plan. I thought I could make it work." "Make it work?" I repeated, disgusted. "You mean you thought you could keep lying forever? What was the plan, Vanessa? To let me play the fool while you paid for a life I didn't even know existed?" Her silence was answer enough. I leaned back, crossing my arms as I looked at her. This woman I thought I knew, who had turned out to be a stranger. "We're done, Vanessa. And this time, there's no coming back." The divorce moved quickly after that. I made sure my lawyer included every ounce of Vanessa's deception in the proceedings. She tried to fight it, claiming she deserved financial support, but the evidence was stacked against her. When it was over, she walked away with nothing but the weight of her own lies. As for Liam, I couldn't blame him. He was just a child, innocent in all of this. But I made it clear that I wouldn't be part of Vanessa's life, or his, any longer. She had made her choices, and now she would live with the consequences. I spent the following months rebuilding. The betrayal left scars, but it also gave me clarity. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. I wasn't living in someone else's shadow, playing a role in a life I didn't recognize. I was free. Vanessa, on the other hand, was left to face the reality she'd tried so hard to hide. Her perfect facade had crumbled, leaving nothing but ruins. And for the first time, I felt no guilt in letting her go. Life after Vanessa was strange, like waking up in a house you'd lived in your whole life and realizing someone had rearranged all the furniture. The routines I had built with her were gone, and the silence that followed was both unsettling and liberating. For the first time in years, I didn't have to second-guess what was happening behind my back or walk on eggshells around someone pretending to love me. I focused on the little things, fixing up the house, reconnecting with old friends, and throwing myself into work. The more I rebuilt, the more I realized how much I had sacrificed for Vanessa's dream world. So many nights spent photographing her from the perfect angle, standing in as her unpaid assistant, cheering for milestones that weren't ours but hers alone. Now I was free to put that energy into something that mattered. Myself. But healing wasn't a straight line. Some days, I felt anger bubbling up again, a bitter knot in my stomach whenever I thought about the lies she had told or the child she'd hidden. Other days, I felt like I was walking through a fog, unsure of who I even was without the identity of being her husband. I had spent so long holding up a life that wasn't mine that I'd forgotten how to live for myself. One of the first steps I took was therapy. I didn't think I needed it at first. Men like me were supposed to handle things on our own, right? But after one too many nights spent staring at the ceiling, replaying every betrayal, I decided to give it a shot. Talking to someone neutral helped me untangle the mess in my head. It wasn't just about Vanessa's infidelity. It was about the way I had let her overshadow everything I valued. 4 years, I had been so afraid of losing her that I didn't realize I'd already lost myself. The divorce became the talk of the neighborhood. People noticed when Vanessa stopped coming around, when her shiny Tesla was replaced with a beat-up sedan, and when she suddenly moved out of state to start fresh. I didn't care much for gossip, but it was hard to ignore the quiet looks of pity from neighbors who once envied what they thought was our perfect marriage. One Saturday, while mowing the lawn, I ran into Ms. Carter, the elderly woman who lived next door. She always had a kind word or a plate of cookies for me and Vanessa, back when things were normal. That day, she approached me with a warm smile but an obvious curiosity. "I haven't seen Vanessa around lately," she said, shielding her eyes from the sun. "Everything okay, Adrian?" I hesitated, unsure how much to share. "We divorced," I said simply. "Things didn't work out." Her face softened. "I'm sorry to hear that. But you seem lighter, if that makes sense." I chuckled, nodding. "It makes a lot of sense, actually." She patted my arm. "Good. You deserve happiness, dear. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Her words stuck with me. I didn't realize how much I needed to hear them until that moment. One evening, while sorting through boxes of things Vanessa had left behind, I stumbled upon an old photo album. Flipping through the pages, I saw the life we'd shared in those early days. Smiling faces, vacations, celebrations. It was bittersweet to see those moments now, knowing how much of it had been tainted by her lies. But instead of feeling anger, I felt a quiet sadness for the man I used to be, the one who loved without question, who trusted blindly. I didn't want to lose that part of myself, even if it made me vulnerable. At the back of the album was a picture I hadn't seen before. It was from our wedding day, Vanessa leaning her head on my shoulder, a look of pure joy on her face. For a moment, I let myself believe it was real, that, at least once, there had been love between us. I closed the album and set it aside, deciding that holding on to the past wouldn't help me move forward. Months turned into a year, and life slowly started to feel normal again. I got back into hobbies I'd abandoned, cycling on the weekends, hiking with friends, even trying my hand at photography for fun, not for likes. I met new people, some of whom became good friends. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was living for myself. As for Vanessa, I heard bits and pieces through mutual acquaintances. She was trying to rebuild her influencer career, but her reputation had taken a serious hit. Brands were hesitant to work with her, and her follower count had plateaued. I didn't revel in her struggles. I was too busy focusing on my own peace to care much about hers. One day, I got an unexpected message from her. It was short and simple. "I'm sorry for everything." I stared at the screen for a long time before typing my response. "I hope you find peace, Vanessa. Take care." And that was it. I didn't need closure from her. I'd found it on my own. She was a chapter in my life, and now, I was ready to turn the page. The day I sent Vanessa that final message, something inside me shifted. It was as though I had been carrying a weight that wasn't mine to bear, and letting go of it felt like I could finally stand taller. I didn't regret my words to her. They were honest and left no room for doubt. Our story was over, and I had no intention of reopening the book. That summer, I started pouring my energy into things that felt meaningful. I took on more responsibility at work, surprising even myself when I was promoted to a leadership role. The long hours didn't bother me. They gave me structure, a sense of accomplishment I hadn't felt in years. Outside of work, I joined a local cycling club, something I'd been meaning to do for ages. It felt good to connect with people who shared my interests, people who saw me as just Adrian, not Vanessa's husband. One Saturday morning, during a group ride, I met someone who would change my perspective in ways I didn't expect. Her name was Claire. She was new to the area, having moved to town for her job as a physical therapist. We ended up riding side by side for most of the route, chatting easily about everything from hobbies to favorite local coffee shops. By the end of the ride, Claire asked if I'd like to grab a coffee sometime. I hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by her directness. But then I realized I wanted to say yes. Not because I was trying to fill the void Vanessa left, but because Claire seemed like the kind of person who could bring light into a life I was rebuilding. We met for coffee the following weekend, and what started as a casual meeting quickly turned into hours of conversation. Claire was warm, funny, and refreshingly grounded. She wasn't looking for validation or applause. She was just herself. Being around her felt easy in a way I hadn't experienced in years. As we got to know each other, I was honest about my past. I told her about Vanessa, the lies, and the betrayal. Claire listened without judgment, her eyes full of empathy. That sounds like it was really hard, she said softly. But the fact that you're here, moving forward, that says a lot about who you are. Her words stayed with me long after that night. For so long, I had defined myself by what Vanessa had done to me, by the pain and the anger. But Claire made me see that I wasn't just a victim. I was someone who had endured and come out stronger. Over the next few months, Claire and I grew closer. She introduced me to her favorite hiking trails, and I taught her how to take better photos with the camera she rarely used. We laughed a lot, something I hadn't realized I missed until she came into my life. With Claire, there were no games, no need to prove anything. She accepted me for who I was. Flaws, scars, and all. One evening, as we sat on my porch watching the sunset, Claire turned to me and said, "You know, you're one of the most resilient people I've ever met." I laughed, shaking my head. "I don't know about that. Some days, it doesn't feel like it." "Maybe not," she said, smiling. "But resilience isn't about feeling strong all the time. It's about showing up, even when it's hard. And you've been doing that." For the first time in years, I let myself believe that I was more than the sum of my past mistakes and heartbreaks. I was someone worth loving, someone worth fighting for, not just by others but by myself. Life wasn't perfect, but it felt real again. The wounds Vanessa left were still there, faint scars that reminded me of where I'd been. But instead of defining me, they became part of my story, a story that was far from over. Claire wasn't a replacement for what I'd lost. She was something new, something better. With her, I didn't feel the need to look back anymore. The future was finally mine to build, one piece at a time. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. A year after Vanessa left, I stood in the backyard of my home, the same house that had once been a stage for her influencer ambitions. It looked different now, simpler, quieter, but somehow more alive. The patio was lined with potted plants Claire had helped me pick out, and the grill was fired up, filling the air with the smell of burgers and veggies. Claire and a few friends from my cycling group were sitting around the fire pit, laughing and passing around drinks. The energy was light, natural. For the first time in years, this house didn't feel like a hollow shell of curated perfection. It felt like home. As the evening settled in, I found myself leaning against the porch railing, watching the glow of the firelight on Claire's face as she animatedly told a story about a disastrous hike she'd been on years ago. She caught me staring and raised an eyebrow, smirking. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," I said, smiling. "Just, thanks for being here." She tilted her head, her expression softening. "You don't have to thank me for that. I want to be here." Her words landed like a bomb, easing the last of the tension I didn't even realize I'd been holding. I walked over, taking a seat beside her. She leaned into me, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel the weight of the past pressing down on my chest. Vanessa's shadow still lingered in small ways, but it no longer defined my life. Occasionally, I'd hear about her through mutual acquaintances. She had tried to restart her career in a different city, but her reputation had never fully recovered. The world she had built on smoke and mirrors had crumbled, leaving her to pick up the pieces on her own. Once, she sent me another message. It was longer this time, more heartfelt. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I wanted you to know I've thought about you every day since the divorce. I wish I had been better, Adrian. I wish I had been the woman you thought I was." I read it twice before deciding not to respond. It wasn't out of spite, I just didn't feel the need. Her regrets were hers to carry, just as I had carried mine. I had moved on, and I wasn't looking back. A few months later, Claire and I went on a weekend hiking trip in the mountains. The trail was challenging but rewarding, leading us to a secluded spot overlooking a serene lake. The sun was just beginning to set, painting the water in shades of gold and orange. As we sat on a rock, catching our breath, Claire reached for my hand. "You've come a long way," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. I nodded, squeezing her hand. "I didn't think I would. For a while, I thought I'd never get past it." "But you did," she said, turning to look at me. "You're here, Adrian. That's what matters." Her words hit me deeply, and for the first time, I allowed myself to feel proud of the journey I'd taken. I had been through hell, but I had come out stronger, more grounded, and more sure of who I was. The past hadn't broken me, It had shaped me into someone who could appreciate the kind of love and life I now had. As we sat there, the sun dipping lower behind the mountains, I realized something important. The story of my life wasn't about betrayal or revenge. It was about resilience, growth, and the courage to start again. And with Claire by my side, I was ready to write the next chapter, one filled with hope, honesty, and a love I finally believed I deserved. The future was mine, and this time, I wasn't afraid to embrace it.